Hi, everybody. Welcome to Soldiers, Sailors, and Spies, a different history. Today, we take a look at 11 alternate history novels, from Stephen King to Newt Gingrich, to Plots Against America and Years of Rice and Salt, from the Black Death Plague to a real Underground Railroad to that traitor George Washington. Wait a minute. Once again, I am joined by Jim Kirchner from the Laurel Branch, and I am Martin Seaboth. Jimmy Klaus is on assignment. So what do we mean when we speak of an alternate history novel or an alternate fiction novel? It is a genre of speculative fiction consisting of stories in which one or more historical events occur differently than they did in real life. The stories, though, of course, are conjectural, but they are sometimes based on facts. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jim for novel number one. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Martin. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you will enjoy this program, and we'll do the best we can to give you some interesting information about these novels. The first book is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. I can hold this up so you can see it. Notice on the back is the alternate occurrence on that day where Kennedy was not assassinated. Now, Stephen King has written many lengthy novels. They go from fantasy and science fiction to horror, and in this case, extremely researched novel about the assassination or the prevention thereof of John F. Kennedy. The general story is there's a teacher who is assisting a person to get his GED, and while working with the gentleman, he gets to know him pretty well. Later on, our main protagonist, his name is Jake Epping, meets a person who has a diner, and he gets to know him as well. There's an amazing thing about the diner is that down in the basement, there's a portal to go back in time. This gentleman who owns the diner over the years has gone back into the pantry, and it takes you to September 9th, 1958 at 11:58 a.m. No matter what you do, you always go back to that moment. There's things about it. You can stay in the past, apparently, for years and do whatever you wish to do, or at least attempt to do. But every time you go back to your time, which in this case of the novel is 2011, everything has been undone. So if you go back to the past more than once, anything that you changed has been undone. However, attempts to change time are met with resistance, whether through nature or other forces. We're not always sure. The more change you'd like to do, such as stopping an assassination or changing history of the world, meets a lot of resistance. So there are consequences to what you do. Now, the owner of the diner decided that he wanted to stop the assassination of JFK because he felt if that happened, then the world would be a better place. Now, he ends up getting cancer and he cannot continue his mission, and sort of forces Jake Epping to do it. Jake's a very emotional and a person who gets involved in the people that he knows. He's a very caring person. So whether he wants to or not, he goes back. Now, he did attempt as an experiment to go back in time to help the person that he had taught the GED to. That person's name was Harry. So he goes back in time because he had learned through teaching Harry that his father had actually murdered his siblings. So Jake prevents this from happening, thinking, you know, it'll be better that this person, you'll get to know him as a much more happy person. Unfortunately, since that occurred when Jake invites himself into that history. Harry actually ends up getting drafted into Vietnam and is killed during the Tet Offensive in 1968. So Jake is learning that this doesn't work as easily as you think. But now he's going back because the owner of the diner, who's now committed suicide, he's on a one-way mission now. He has to get carried out, or he feels he has to carry it out. He gets there in 1958 again and takes his time over the next few years, establishing himself as a teacher, learning how to act in the late 50s, because he is a fairly liberal person. One of the first things he has to do is get a haircut and so forth and so on. And he scopes out the country and what's going on and learns local people and ends up in researching in Dallas. And one of the things that each person who's tried to do this discovers that, at least in this novel, Oswald does act alone. He is the lone gunman. There's no other conspiracy that they can determine. So very carefully, Jake gets himself involved. He actually ends up meeting Oswald and the other people who were all part of that event. But he also meets a young lady whom he falls in love with. Over the time that this takes place, Jake eventually gets to the point where he is in fact right there at the book depository, and he does in fact stop Oswald from shooting Kennedy. But one of the rounds actually shoots and mortally wounds the young lady that he's fallen with, that he actually wanted to marry. Her name is Sadie. So he's successful in stopping the assassination, but other people die instead. So Jake is immediately a hero, but of course he's not happy with any of this. So he tries to disappear. He actually goes back to Reset through the diner and back to 2011, and ends up talking with the now version of people that he got to know back in the 50s and 60s. And it turns out that Kennedy does get reelected, but there is no Civil Rights Act. There are things that did happen, even though they were part of a very violent decade. Didn't happen, or happened much later in different ways. So there's no immediate involvement in Vietnam until Wallace actually gets elected in '68, and Martin Luther King is still assassinated. There's even more civil rights tension because there had not been any of the laws that the LBJ administration passed. At least, trying to get some movement forward in that regard. And then in Vietnam, they decide to just go ahead and use nuclear weapons. And so the world in the 60s into the 70s is much worse than you might have imagined. And there's also other nuclear exchanges. There's a war between India and Pakistan, multiple earthquakes. Basically, the world is pretty much a wreck compared to what Jake remembers. So he, again, is not sure, is this nature just trying to reset everything, try to teach him a lesson? He's not sure, but he does not want to go back, but realizes that he must. So he decides he's going to go back and save not only Kennedy, but his fiancée. Again, with what he hopes will be careful planning. However, through some soul searching, he knows that one way or the other, the world is going to reset itself. What he attempts to do could be futile or much more damaging to the rest of the world than what he wishes for himself or thinks would be the good idea. So he, one last time, returns back to 2011. Everything is reset. even though he does remember what happened. And by happenstance, he does meet Sadie, the woman that he was going to marry, who's now an elderly woman, of course. And it's at a dance or something. And she asks, do I know you? And he said, no, you may have known me in another life, but not this one. So it's a very long and detailed book. It's well researched. It's extremely human story, emotional story. And you get the sense that King really went all out for this kind of storytelling. So there's a great deal to look at. And again, it is a long book, but it's very enjoyable as far as I know.
Well, I know also, Jim, having saw the TV specials with that book highlighted, looking at the New York Times bestseller list and all, it's a tremendously popular book. What do you think makes it more popular than, let's say, other well-written historical novels?
Well, I think because it's within the last 10 years, King is a good storyteller. Many people might try to remember, oh, he wrote Carrie and Christine, those strange horror stories. The novels are rather more exceptional than those 70s and 80s movies. They were not the best made cinema. And there's tons of detail that are in the books that are not in those movies. So you would want to think more of King, the novelist, not the movie scriptwriter. The story, as I said, is a very human story. It's Jake's journey. And even though he has to take that journey several times, he learns more and more each time that we're not alone in the universe, that everything you do has consequences and connections to everybody else. And as much as you would like to do that classic, if he went back and stopped Hitler from becoming the leader of the Nazi Germany, there are just things that just follow perhaps as they're supposed to. Like some people might say that, but it's something that you care about. You wanted him to succeed, and then when he did, you realized that, was this the right thing to do, or did things just, again, do they happen the way they're supposed to? And how was that decided?
So a very human element to it.
Because it's not up to each of us, although each of us has a part to play.
Thank you, Jim. Our next book we're going to start with is Colson Whiteheads, The Underground Railroad. And this is one terrific book. The book won the Pulitzer Prize for the National Book Award and was an Oprah Book Club selection. And oh yeah, it went to #1 on the New York Times best-selling fiction chart as well. I can tell you that this is an extraordinarily written book that lets you experience all of Cora's travails on her attempted road to freedom. Cora is a slave on a cotton plantation in Georgia. Life, of course, is terrible for all slaves, but especially bad for Cora, who is an outcast even among her fellow Africans. When Caesar, a recent arrival, tells her about the Underground Railroad, they decide to take a risk and escape. Things, of course, do not go as planned. Cora kills a young white boy who tries to capture her. Though they manage to find a station and head north, they are being hunted. In Whitehead's book, the Underground Railroad is real. There are engineers and conductors who operate a secret network of tracks and tunnels beneath the southern soil. Cora's and Caesar's first stop is South Carolina, which initially seems like a haven compared to Georgia. But before long, Ridgway, a relentless slave catcher, is close on their heels. Faced to flee again, Cora encounters different worlds at each step of her journey, an odyssey of both time and of space. Whitehead brilliantly recreates the unique terrors for Black people in the pre-Civil War era. The novel also somehow weaves the saga of America from the brutal importation of Africans to the unfulfilled promises of the present day. Highly, highly recommended.
I think that it's interesting that the caveat that the Underground Railroad was an actual railroad in the novel. When I was a kid, I actually thought that.
Me too. That's funny that you did. Yeah, I did too. I thought there was a railroad that they all got on. Yeah, and I know now it reminds me, like someone once told me when I was saying about this and reading the book, they were like, hey, it's the Metro. And it's underground, it's operated. But then you start to have questions like, well, why couldn't they hear it? And, you don't think of all these things during, the pre-Civil War times. But very, very ingenious book. Definitely one I would recommend. And now another one that we might recommend to Jim for Kim Stanley Robinson's book.
Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Next one we have is called The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson. This is a different kind of book. It's quite interesting. It is from 2002. It is also an award-winning book, as I believe almost every book that we have on this list is. It describes and discusses themes of history, religion, social movements, and the narrative is a little different than a normal book, that different events, the general main characters are reincarnated in another time and place, but they're recognizable as those individuals that you had already gotten to know. The basic premise is the Black Death plague kills 99% of the European population. That is twice as much, at least, as what really happened. So it's divided into 10 parts. It goes through several centuries. Because basically Northern Western Europe is a wasteland, more or less, other civilizations fill in the void, such as the Muslims are much more prevalent in exploring and in conquest of what was once Europe. Now they are in competition with mostly Asian populations, the Chinese particularly, as the predominant society, overrunning basically what would have been Japan and Korea and so forth. And so that is all under their sphere of influence. There are wars fought back and forth for territory and social prominence over the different regions. They also both main organizations, if you will, both cultures compete for exploration, including into the New World. Now, because the age of discovery and so forth from white European cultures doesn't happen, the Native Americans in the North and South Americas become and evolve into a relatively stable and dominant indigenous population. So they are, in a way, a third superpower, if you will. This sets up the background where these individuals discover who they are and why they do what they do. There's a lot of Buddhism discussion, a lot of Muslim discussion, what would probably be described as shamanism and so forth, Americans. And it does go, again, through many centuries, describing the consequences and the personal gains and losses, and eventually knowledge that all these individuals will come to know. Because there are 10 different books, you want to follow these in order, because as I said, the characters are reincarnated through history. And it ultimately becomes a story of belief and destiny and how the world could have been and may still become. So it's might not be one that you would think of to read as an alternate history, but it gives you an exceptional worldwide view of a different world, starting from the bubonic, from the Black Plague, to a modern, absolutely different world that is not impossible to believe in.
Sounds fascinating that that book, now that we're living in the age of COVID,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the first thing I think of is if you take the Black Plague that knocked out, you know, that most historians think around 35% of Europe. But this book takes it that it knocks out 99% of Europe. And then you have big demographic changes. You would have big country power changes. I mean, it sounds like a fascinating concept. Like I said, especially living in the age of COVID-19, which we're not sure how that's all going to shake down. And then, once the 2 years or so are hopefully over. So definitely a fantastic book. The next one I'm going to do is called The Trial and Execution of the Traitor, George Washington. What's this about?
I want to know what happens.
Well, I can tell you. British Special Agent Jeremiah Black, an officer of the King's Guard, lands on a lonely beach in the wee hours of the morning in late November 1780. The revolution is in full swing by this point, but has become deadlocked. Jeremiah Black is here to change that. His mission is to kidnap George Washington and send him back to London on the ship, the HMS Peregrine, that is waiting nearby offshore. Once Washington lands, though, many of the loyalists would prefer just to kill the general outright. Black manages just to get Washington aboard the ship. Upon its arrival in London, Washington is imprisoned in the Tower to await trial on charges of high treason. He chooses Abraham Hobhouse, an American-born barrister with an English wife, to represent him. He's a man who doesn't really need the work and thinks that this will be a career-building case for him that will be easily resolved and Washington will be released. But as greater political and military forces swirl around them and peace seems ever more distant, Hobhouse finds that he is the only thing keeping Washington from being executed. Rosenberg drew inspiration for this novel from an actual kidnapping plot hatched in 1776 by a member of Washington's own Commander-in-Chief Guards in creating this novel. This was Rosenberg's first alternate history novel and was a finalist for the Sidewise Alternate History Award. His latest is entitled The Day Lincoln Lost, which I'm looking forward to reading. And back to Jim for one of the great alternate history writers of all time, Harry Turtledove.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Harry Turtledove's The Guns of the South, an alternate history where, as so many stories go, where the South wins the Civil War. Here we have the cover. General Lee there. Now, this one is a little different. There are others that always take this idea, what if the South had won? In this case, it's 1864, just before the Battle of the Wilderness, and the Confederates are not doing too well. All of a sudden, they get a strange visitor who offers them a type of weapon that's never been seen before and can make an absolute dramatic difference in the course of the war. The man's name is Rudy, and he is in fact a South African nationalist from the period where apartheid still exists, or certainly in his heart. He's decided to come back with some of his friends and introduce the AK-47, the Russian automatic weapon, to the Confederate Army, or at least to the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee, of course, is a little suspicious. This gentleman doesn't seem to fit in anywhere. His clothes, his mannerisms, his accent is unknown. But the weapon does work, and they're able to provide them with copies. And the Armaments Division in Richmond works on trying to create enough shells and copies and so forth. And it does make a dramatic difference. The power of the weapon causes so many casualties in the North that despite their best efforts and General Grant's attempts to stop the Confederate advance, the South does in fact retake Washington, D.C. and demands an armistice. Reluctantly, the Union accepts this, and the country is now divided in the United States versus the Confederate states. The idea from Rudy and the South African militia, since they had in fact built a time machine and they go back to this period and back and forth to modern day as needed, that is kept an absolute secret from Lee and his generals and the Confederate and Union governments. One of the things that the South is able to copy is the South Africans brought nitroglycerin tablets. It might be known to people who study history that Lee actually had failing health from probably about 1863 on till his death, which was in normal timeline is 1870, I believe. So he is given these pills which help him with his heart condition. He also learns that these secret time travelers, not that he understands that, they have a collection of books from modern day, which of course tells the story of the actual events in the Civil War as we know them. And it also discusses the changes particularly for civil rights for African Americans and others. And Lee, who, even though he's the leader of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and a slave owner, starts to realize that slavery itself, even if you want to put aside the moral obligation, it's the evilness of it. It's also not something that can be sustained, not in a modern society, not in any society really, but he starts to be interested in politics himself, not that he wishes to. So there actually becomes what would be a civil rights movement or laws enacted where slavery is ended. Now, the South African guy, of course, one of the reasons they wanted to do this is because they believed in white supremacy and had no interest in changing history just so that all people would end up being free anyway. So the Confederates end up fighting these gentlemen, end up destroying the time machine. And even though the country is divided now, apparently forever, that the progress, the hopefulness that a better society, both North and South, is inevitable and possible. And Lee himself is going to be one of those people who will attempt to push it forward. He actually becomes president of the Confederacy. And with these history books from our future, attempts to make things right, at least in that particular alternate reality, which again is a bit different. But perhaps in the end, it would not be so different. Anyway,
Thank you, Jim. I know some of our viewers might be thinking, my God, what a concept that the AK-47 is going to be a big factor in changing the result of Civil War. That turtle dove is really crazy. And yet I'm sitting there thinking also, this is actually a conservative quote for turtle dove. He takes some concepts in his books that are almost off the charts. So if you like really out there ideas changing history, I mean, I know from my readings I would recommend Turtle Dove. What would you think to people listening out here, Jim?
I would recommend him. And once again, most of these books are, some of the people that I hope that we're reaching are actually historians or students of history. People are interested in military fiction and so forth, just as this is sort of within this very broad sense of techno-thrillers and things of that nature. The detail and the research in this book and all the books is, despite the fact that this has fantastic elements, like, hey, let's go back in time and give generally a bunch of machine guns, see what happens, you know. That's an off-the-wall idea, but makes it work. It doesn't, the fantastic element is just simply the, I guess the MacGuffin or whatever you'd want to say within a story frame. But you know, once it's done, then it's not like suddenly they're driving tanks and things like that and you know, chasing Abraham Lincoln around. You know, it way it would probably could happen in the sense that Robert E. Lee and Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant and the others are still within their character, well, at least as we know them, or at least as certainly within other novels. But so this is not like a Tom Holt novel where you know, werewolves run the IRS or something like that, which are all totally fun stories that we may do something about fantasy and sci-fi at another time. But these are believable, and I think most authors of alternate history are very much attempting to keep it. Once they have an idea and a story, they want to keep it as real as it could be. And you know, if you're interested in alternate fiction, then I think you want to see this change or something different happen. But then you want to find out what happens after that. It's like, okay, so the Union loses Gettysburg, but then what happens? And in a few minutes, we'll find out in another book.
Yeah, I know both of us, obviously, this is a favorite for both of us, Guns of the South. And one thing that you mentioned is so true. His research and technical aspect of the book is extraordinary. I mean, you feel like you're sitting on the grass and, you know, in the Civil War. I mean, he really gives you all the details with it. So even though you start with the concept, of course, with the AK-47s, that didn't happen, you're getting 95% of things that really did happen in the Civil War. So you do learn a lot through history, especially a well-researched author like Turtle Dove.
Exactly. Exactly.
And speaking of a well-researched author, we're going to go to Philip Roth, The Plot Against America. For me, this was the very first alternate history novel that I read some 15 plus years ago. You see, I was presenting at a system-wide adult services book discussion conference, and I had volunteered to give a 30-minute presentation on alternate history novels. So I checked with lots of people in the system that were experts and checked with other people through the field of alternate history novels. And every single one I checked with said, if you do one novel, you've got to read The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. So I did. Roth's best-selling novel is the chilling story of what happens to one Jewish family when America elects a charismatic isolationist president. Roth imagines an alternate history where Franklin Delano Roosevelt loses the 1940 presidential election to a heroic aviator and rabid isolationist, Charles A. Lindbergh. Shortly thereafter, Lindbergh negotiates a cordial understanding with Adolf Hitler, keeping America largely on the sideline, and the new government embarks on anti-Semitic trends and humor, which of course wasn't the least bit funny to lots of people. In 2005, The Plot Against America received the Society of American Historians Prize for the Outstanding Historical Novel on an American Theme, and the William H. Smith Award for the Best Book of the Year. This is an excellent book for starting your perusal into the most interesting world of alternate history. Any resemblance to real-life characters in 2021 is purely accidental, or is it? And now I'm going to head back to our friend Jim, who is going to talk about a book by Len Dighton.
Thank you, Mark. Now we come to Len Dighton's SSGB. This is an alternate history novel that's set in the United Kingdom around 1941, after Germany has invaded and, in fact, succeeded in winning the war against Great Britain. The general idea is a detective is trying to solve a murder. However, because of the political intrigue, the situation of being occupied, the consequences of the concentration camps, POWs, all of that sort of thing, there's a lot more going on than what this gentleman is simply trying to solve a murder. But everybody, one way or the other, is probably involved. So he has to deal with the German army officers who are in charge of the region, controlling London. The SS, who of course have their own agenda. There is a resistance by the British civilians. And there's also just the general criminal element that he's trying to deal with as a policeman. So he does his best to balance his investigation to everybody's satisfaction. That seems to be almost impossible. So he's trying to solve this murder. And the more he gets involved in the investigation, the more obstacles seem to be thrown in his way. He meets some members of the resistance, some that he knows are members of the resistance, and some that he doesn't. And the consequences are that his life is in constant danger. One of the aspects of this, the United States, Joseph P. Kennedy is still the ambassador. And similar to the novel that Martin just mentioned, Kennedy, although not an isolationist, was not a fan of Great Britain. So the U.S. appears to be generally neutral. probably is making its own plans about how would they get involved in this war, while the United States is still generally isolationist and has no base or friend anywhere in Europe now that the UK is defeated. All of this ends up coming ahead where there's atomic research being done, and some of the resistance are part of that, whether they want to destroy it or give the information to someone else, but at least keep it from German scientists. And in fact, near the climax of the story, the United States does in fact send a very small landing party to steal the information and destroy anything that's left over in the laboratories. So the Germans are denied the information. Presumably the US now has the information and runs back home across the Atlantic. And the detective continues his work, and all under the umbrella that one day, probably soon, the war will continue and the United States will come back. And we'll see what happens then. So there's a lot more details. Sorry?
This sounds like it reads almost like a mystery novel.
It is pretty much that. You just have to take the fact that the UK has been defeated. Everything you do with personal life and business life is under surveillance and being judged, and you, at any moment, if you're considered an enemy by the multiple competing agencies who want to control everybody's lives or end them, you have to be careful every moment. And that's what this gentleman has to navigate in the background of this war is still going on. It's not over by any means.
Sounds like a fascinating novel.
It is an older one, but Deaton did a whole bunch of books that were related more or less to Great Britain's involvement in World War II, that is. And he might not have too many in print right now, but they are still available. He is definitely one of the large name British authors from the 1970s.
That might be of special interest to those viewers that are, historians or maybe college students interested in the subject that would really like to go back and read some different people.
This is also a TV series on BBC, I believe.
Wow.
So you can follow along the story there as well as the book. The book is probably a little more concise than the TV show, because I believe there are 2 or 3 series now. That is readily available.
And we are going to finish off with number 8, our 8th novel. And then we have sort of an extra credit or a surprise to finish us off. But this will be the last one that we do. And it is called Then Everything Changed by Jeff Greenfield. Stunning alternative histories of American politics. JFK, RFK, Carter, Ford, and Reagan, and even more. As you can tell by the title, this is like a smorgasbord of alternate histories presented to you by a terrific chef. In this case, Emmy Award-winning television journalist, Jeff Greenfield. Greenfield has appeared in many venues throughout his career, including William F. Buckley's Firing Line on ABC News, both on Nightline and World News Sunday. On CNN, he was their lead analyst for politics. And finally, on CBS, as a senior political correspondent and as a contributor to the CBS Evening News. Jeff has a hilarious, biting sense of humor that is prevalent in this book and was present in many election night coverages and interviews that I saw Greenfield execute. These things are true. In December 1960, a suicide bomber paused when he saw young President-elect John F. Kennedy's family come to the door to wave goodbye. In June 1968, Robert F. Kennedy declared victory in California, and then instead of heading to another ballroom, as was usual protocol, he was hustled off through the kitchen. In October 1976, President Ford made a critical gaffe in a debate against Jimmy Carter, turning the tide in an election that had been rapidly narrowing. But what if all these events had gone the other way? In 3 narratives based on memories, oral histories, fresh reporting with key participants, and his own knowledge of the principal players, Jeff Greenfield explores how accidents of fate could have altered the course of history. The book has a terrific afterword entitled How Reality Shapes Speculation, which mentions various events and then discusses the plausibility of what Greenfield presented in his book. This is a fun book, let me tell you, that nevertheless presents to you deep background facts in laying a sturdy ground to Greenfield's alternate history. How do you think Gary Hart would have done as president? All right, and our final set is actually 3 novels. It's a trilogy, and it's written by Newt Gingrich and William Forstchen. And the first novel is called Gettysburg. The second one is called Grant Comes East. And the third one is Never Call Retreat. Forstchen, who does not get a majority of the publicity because, of course, Newt Gingrich is being more famous, is quite a writer in his own right. He has a young adult novel called We Look Like Men of War, which was about an African-American regiment that fought in the Civil War. He also is perceived to be an expert on George Washington, writing 3 different books. He has joined Gingrich for this Gettysburg Trilogy, and together their talents produce 3 great novels. Now, Jim, I'd like you to, if you'd like to add in some stuff as well about that, and then we'll wrap up our presentation. Feels like the time goes like this. It's always fun just talking about great books.
I hope everyone will agree. I certainly do. Well, this trilogy, called the Gettysburg Trilogy, once again takes us to the what if that at the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg, a place that probably many people in this general region may have visited, and I recommend that you do when, certainly when the pandemic is over. It takes the premise, again, of a very human story and creating characters that probably could have existed, men from North Carolina and Georgia and so forth. And they follow the actual history of how the Union Army and Confederate armies ended up meeting at Gettysburg, which was not actually the intent of either force, but did in fact occur as one unit met scouts from another unit and so forth and so on. The idea that in the first day or two, the battle occurs as history is recorded. But there's some mention, again, as in Guns of the South, he may or may not have had a heart attack or something like that, angina, pain, confusion during or right before the battle. And the term is, General, your blood is up, is how the other staff members of his army call it. They have to be extremely polite, of course, but they do the best they can. But so instead of actually having picket do his charge, and the great carnage that continues on that day, leading to a Union victory, he decides to do what he had always done that made him successful, and particularly with the now deceased Stonewall Jackson. He decides to flank and move south. And this, interestingly, especially if you're from Maryland or Pennsylvania or Virginia, it mentions towns and places that you probably recognize. So the big battle that we know doesn't occur. But another battle does, where it's in fact Meade and the Union forces that have to attempt a futile attack on defended Confederate ground, because they have the high ground in this case. And it ends in a total disaster. At the end of that particular first part of the novel, Lincoln, who's in the White House, they are starting to panic that this didn't happen the way they're hoping. So he sends a letter out west to General Grant. Says, "Would you please head over as fast as you can, because we need help here." General Meade is now dead, and one of the main survivors is General Sickles. Now, in the second book, he is involved in blaming somebody else, taking credit for any success that there was. He goes back to New York because he puts down riots, riots, all sorts of things in the United States. While a few level-headed generals are convinced, assure Lincoln that, well, we can rebuild all this if you keep the will the way that the colonials did in the Revolutionary War. No matter how bad it seemed, we can still do this. We can move the capital to Philadelphia or Harrisburg or anywhere. As long as you want to keep fighting, because this is about not just the battles itself, which are extremely detailed, but the will to win, and what is it that you're trying to win. And Lee himself starts to wonder. And there are interesting tidbits where there's a gentleman who works in the White House, an African American, who, when a very small boy, remembered when the White House was burned in 1850. And Lincoln starts to learn a lot and said, "Gee, I didn't know that you knew all these things." And one of the emphasis is, "Mr. President, I and all of my other family members and friends, we've been here all along. All you had to do was just look at us." And one of the things he says to him is that, this gentleman's, I believe one of his grandsons died young, just as Lincoln lost children too. And the gentleman says, "Well, it's okay. Both children are playing together in heaven now. So you don't need to worry about it." And Lincoln starts to think, "Oh, that's interesting, because apparently there is no racism in heaven. So what do you think about that?" And he starts to slowly learn, as I believe he did in reality, the righteousness of the cause, if you will. And in any case, in the second book, the Confederates attempt to take Washington, but they fail. Grant comes east with his forces. It's his time. Sickles, the political general, thinks he can figure it out and become the victor, but he fails again. So it's even more disaster for the Union Army, at least for the Army of the Potomac. And there are, again, little details. You may know the story of Glory about the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment. Instead of going to South Carolina, where most of them do die, they actually make it to Washington, D.C. just in time to assist in repelling the Confederates. So there are interesting alternate futures for people that actually did exist. Some don't survive and some do. Ultimately, Grant and Lee meet around I believe it's around the Catoctin Mountains, that general area, Frederick, and so forth. And among them are many African American soldiers. And the Union is finally victorious. So basically, the premise is in 1863, the fury, carnage, bloodlust, social and moral upheaval that really it took another century and is still going on today is literally forced into being, whereas the Union survives, wins, and it sets up a United States where things would be better for all people, particularly for African Americans and others. And it is somehow earned and learned during that horrible period, that this is how it needs to be. And as horrible as it was in the story, it actually has perhaps a better or speeded up conclusion. Although this is not a conclusion, this is a story that continues on and on. So it's quite interesting to see how this goes. You think a Confederate victory would mean one thing, but in fact it does not. And many historians would probably say that the South probably couldn't have won ultimately anyway because of all the resources that the North had, particularly Abraham as a resource and a leader. And yet another one who paid the price for that.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, everybody, for viewing today. We're really glad everybody tuned in. Hopefully you learned something and maybe thinking about picking up a book you might not normally have picked up. If you like events like this, there's many others like this through our webpage at www.pgcmls.info. If you would like to comment on this program, Jim Kirchner is my colleague here. My name is Martin Seaboth. Please let us know. Let us know how we can improve the program. Let us know what you've enjoyed. If anybody in our library system or guests out here would like to participate in a program, our goal is to have another program sometime in the fall. So please let us know. Like I said, this time Jimmy was unable to join us. So sometimes we always would welcome guests as well about our program. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time around.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Okay.